Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Thanks for joining me. For those that don't know me, I'm Travis Rhodes. As you can see, I'm out in the backyard. Again, I've started many videos this way, but tonight I'm actually out here photographing the birds that like to try to upstage me when I'm doing some of my intros. I've taken to bird photography here in the backyard to try to get a little shutter therapy during these times when you can't really travel as much. And it's been really nice to come out in the backyard and kind of decompress a little bit, get the mind off of things. It's very peaceful to sit back here listening to the birds and just enjoying watching them and learning about them, because I'm always trying to learn something new. So this episode is going to be all about blending exposures, both of different shutter durations, but also using different filters, sometimes with a CPL, sometimes without. There are often times in one image where you want part of the image to have the effect of a circular polarizer, and other times where you don't. So we're going to learn how to blend some of that, and blending images of different shutter durations for different reasons, both if you might have foliage movement in the background or the foreground, but also blending different shutter speeds for the water, because some water looks better at some shutter speeds than other shutter speeds. And so in an image you might want to have both 2 or 3 different kind of shutter speeds for one image. So that's what we're going to do tonight. We're going to go over the methods I use for blending those different exposures together and creating one final image. So I'll go ahead and put the big lens away and we'll get on into the studio and get started. In our first example for this session, I'm going to blend 2 different images with 2 different shutter speeds. And this is done on this particular image for 2 reasons. The first reason is the breeze was just enough that this little fern here on this log would move just a little bit in a longer exposure here in 2 seconds. If I zoom in, you can see that the fern is not very sharp. You can see it's moved just a tiny bit over that 2-second exposure. And if printed, that's going to show up really bad. At the 1/50th of a second, when I zoom in on the fern, you can see that it is actually very, very sharp. But this particular image, I was also doing something a little different. I was shooting the fern at f2.8. on this 45mm tilt shift lens, and I really wanted the shallow depth of field as it faded away into the background, but what I really wanted was to have the long exposure effect of the water. But if I put my filters on at shallow depth of field, I still ended up with movement in the fern. And so the fern wasn't sharp, and the fern is really my subject in this image. So with the fern not being sharp and not being able to get the moving water all in one frame, I had to resort to doing this in 2 frames. Doing the frame for the fern with no filters, and then shooting one in a longer exposure at a much smaller aperture to get the 2 seconds to get the water moving in the background. Now this presents a little bit of a challenge, that this image has good sharpness front to back because it was shot at f16, and this image was shot at f2.8, and what I really wanted was that little bit of a blur back there. So that made it a little bit extra challenging on the edit, but we're going to get into that. Moving over into Photoshop, I have all 3 of my images here. I say 3 because I have created a copy of the image that is the long exposure that has good depth of field. And I've created a copy of it, and I've applied just enough of a blur to try to mimic and match the blur in the background of the shallow depth of field image. What I did was applied a little blur to this image, just kind of toggling on and off just to see if I was getting somewhere in the realm of what the rest of the image from this point through this little trunk on back to the background of the image looked like. And once I was happy with what the blur looked like, then I could start blending my image together. And you can see what I really only kept from the long exposure image was the water. So I created a layer mask and painted in just the water areas and a little bit of the fringes just to blend it in, so that I could keep the ferns really sharp and keep that long exposure effect on the water in the background. Now this trick might also be helpful if you have a scene where your foreground or background is leaves and they're moving, and your longer exposure for the water results in leaf blur, or where the leaves are blowing around in the wind in the background. And this is why I talk about exposing multiple frames at a variety of exposures from faster to longer. That way, once you're back in the darkroom, you can take those shorter exposures for the background and leaves and everything and blend them into your images that are the long exposure. This allows you to have multiple exposures to work with when you're trying to blend them back together. If you find that you had some leaf movement in the leaves that are on the other side of the creek, or maybe the near side of the creek, that are distracting, and you want to try to blend that back in to try to keep from having a little bit of movement in the leaves. So if you have the whole wide range of exposures from short to long, you can easily blend those back together. And that's one reason I really like color neutral filters, is that the color shift doesn't change from one frame to the next, from no filters to filters. When you're using a color neutral filter, you'll be able to keep the color consistent across all of the frames. So let's go on to the next example. In this second example, we're going to be looking at an image that is a blend of two different versions of the same scene, one with a circular polarizer and one without. What you see on screen here is what was captured without the circular polarizer being enabled. And when I say enabled, it wasn't rotated to give full effect. And you can see that the sunshine that was up here in the sky and the really bright sky was causing a lot of glare on this foreground reflecting pool. But it was keeping the nice reflections of the fall color in the far reflecting pool. But when I enabled or rotated my circular polarizer, I cut down on the glare here in the front, but I lost a lot of the reflection in that pool in the background. And to me, I really wanted a combination of both. I wanted the reflecting pool of this portion of the image, and I wanted the less glare of this image, and I also wanted the less glare on the leaves back here in the background on all the fall color. You can see a pretty good difference in the leaves here when you have the circular polarizer inactive to active. We keep a lot of that color in those leaves and don't have a lot of the reflection and glare off of those leaves that we would have shooting without a CPL. So we're going to blend both of these images together. So we're going to jump over here into Photoshop. I have the non-CPL image loaded on top of the CPL image. So this is the CPL image here, and this is the non-CPL image. And you can see that the layer mask is really painted in just for that area. I'm just painting in that little reflecting pool into the CPL image so that I keep the nice deepened, more saturated colors of the trees, the reduced glare on this pond, but I get to keep the nice color and reflection of the fall color in the pond back here that the CPL kind of reduced. It muted it a little bit, and I really liked that color reflecting in there. So this is a really easy one. Very simple, not a lot of work involved, but it allows me to blend the two different versions of the same scene to get the desired effect of keeping the nice reflection in the pond and cutting down on this glare here in the front that was really, really strong. If I take and disable that layer mask, that's just overpowering. That's just too strong and not what I want in an image. That really takes away from an otherwise interesting image. So I want to keep the glare down here, but I also want to keep the color reflected here. So that's where blending with two different filtered images comes into play. And now we're going to go on to the third image of blending different shutter speeds together. In our final example of the evening, we're going to blend two different exposures that have two different shutter speeds. I want to do this on this image because there are elements of this image that I really like at one shutter speed and elements that I much prefer at another shutter speed. As you can see here, this is the 0.5 second exposure. And in this image, I really like the texture and the movement in the water right in here and the textures right through this middle ground area. I like the way the water is reflecting the color of the trees in the background. It has a very painterly effect. But what I don't really like is the texture right here in the water and the way the water spills over this flat rock and through here in the background. For those, I much prefer this version of the image that is a 4-second exposure. So we're going to blend those two together, and we're going to do that in Photoshop. As always, make your edits on one image and apply that to all of the images in the range that you're going to work with. That way you have consistent and uniform color, contrast, balance, texture, vibrance, and saturation, making sure that those values are all the same in both. That way they blend together nice and seamlessly. Once we have those images in Photoshop, we'll load them as layers, one on top of the other. As you can see here, I've labeled this one the shorter exposure, and I've labeled this one the longer exposure. I'm going to disable that layer mask so that you can see it turn on and off. Here in the longer exposure, when I highlight it, you can see that it is the longer exposure for the entire frame over the shorter exposure. When I enable the layer mask for what I have painted, you can see I've brought in just little areas of it. I've brought in this area, I've brought in some of the water back here, I've brought in lightly in here to smooth out some of that texture. But I have left all of this area here in the middle from the shorter exposure that has that really nice texture and painterly effect in the water. And that is the blending of these two exposures to one, and then I'll go through at that point after I have done my layer mask and painted those two in. I'll start my edits in the different plugins that I use in my workflow, and those are all applied to the blended image of the two, and that brings me to my final image. So again, it's just very subtle blending of longer exposure for the pour over these rocks and these rocks in here, and a shorter exposure to keep this texture in this water that really looks nice, that kind of gets lost in this one. That water kind of loses a little bit of that interesting quality that this water has. So a little bit of layer mask and a little bit of blending brings us to an image that has a nice kind of seamless quality that keeps some of that texture in this water, but keeps some of the nice spillover and nice flow back here and nice spillover on this rock here in the middle ground. And we end up with a nice blended image out of two different shutter speeds, one at 0.5 seconds and one at 4 seconds. I hope you'll forgive me for going a little long this evening. I wanted to get these 3 concepts done in one video, but didn't want to rush it. I didn't want to make it seem too fast and gloss over too much of what is really important about applying these 3 techniques to your images in the future. So I apologize for going a little long. If you like what you saw this week, please hit the like button, leave me a comment, and hit that subscribe button. See you next week. Thanks.